By day, she mopped the marble corridors of Harvard School of Architecture, but at night, in a janitor's closet no larger than a coffin, she sketched bridges that even final-year students dared not attempt. The corridor on the third floor smelled faintly of disinfectant and chalk dust. Clara James, 30 years old, leaned into the mop, her back bent as if she herself were a girder bowed under load. The fluorescent lamps cast a pale light that trembled across the tiles, making her shadow long and uncertain. No one paused to watch her. No one ever did. Professors and students brushed by, their conversations thick with equations and critiques, their eyes fixed ahead. Clara listened. She always listened. Years earlier, under the humid sky of Louisiana, Clara had worn a hard hat instead of latex gloves and held survey poles instead of mop handles. She had been a scholarship student, one of the rare black women accepted into an engineering program focused on civil structures. Her professors once said she had a gift for seeing loads not just as numbers, but as forces breathing through steel. But at 18, a baby's cry in the night eclipsed the language of beams and girders. She left campus. She worked on road crews. She loved and married a man who hammered bolts into bridges until his lungs gave way to silicosis. She buried him too early, and she cleaned floors to survive. When the last trash bin was emptied and the last hallway gleamed, Clara sat alone on the stairwell landing. She unfolded scraps, discarded printouts, pizza boxes, strings of fishing line left behind by students. Her hands moved with a patience born of grief. She cut, folded, and tied. A truss emerged, a miniature suspension span. She whispered formulas under her breath like a psalm. Moment equals force times distance. Shear balanced by compression. Deflection proportional to length cubed. The words anchored her in a world that might have been. Clara had never walked across the bridges she made. They were too fragile for feet, too private for witnesses. Yet they carried her grief, spanning the dark gulf between what she had lost and what she still hoped to give. On a late November night, the door creaked open. A young man stumbled in, pale, hollow-eyed, clutching rolled drawings like a wounded soldier with a flag. "I cannot do it," he whispered. "The suspension design. I cannot even build the model. I am dropping out." Clara rose slowly. Her eyes, gentle yet carved by sorrow, met his. "Show me," she said. He hesitated. She motioned him into the cramped janitor's closet, where the faint bulb flickered above mops and detergent bottles. With calm precision, Clara cut into a cardboard box. She laced fishing line through holes, forming slender arcs. She spoke as she worked. When wind strikes a bridge, it does not only push, it sings. Each span has its own frequency, like a violin string. If the wind matches that frequency, the bridge shakes, sometimes to collapse. We call it resonance. The student's eyes widened. The equation scribbled on his notes, natural frequency equals stiffness over mass, suddenly meant more than chalk. She tightened the line. But if we distribute the load, stiffen the joints, the bridge hums safely, like teaching it the right song. For the first time in weeks, the young man breathed without trembling. By dawn, a model stood between them, modest, fragile, but sound. The boy touched it as though it were sacred. Tears rimmed his lashes. Clara only smiled, her hands scarred with calluses from mops and from a past of steel rivets. The next day, his classmates gasped at the model's elegance. Professors nodded. He presented equations of stress, shear, and dynamic response. Applause filled the hall. Clara, meanwhile, guided her mop past the same doorway, her gaze lowered. Afterward, the student searched for her, paper trembling in his grip. "They asked who helped me. I told them about you. They will put your name— No. Her voice was steady, quiet as midnight rain. Let me keep the drawing in my closet. That is enough. He wanted to protest, but her eyes that had watched her husband cough blood into a rag, eyes that had seen dreams dissolve in baby bottles and unpaid bills, silenced him. Clara returned to her closet. She set the cardboard bridge on the shelf above bleach bottles and rags. She rested her palm lightly on its deck, as though touching her husband's shoulder one last time. In that dim room where no dean ever entered, the bridge shone brighter than any structure on Harvard Yard. The first snowfall of December fell across Harvard Yard like sifted flour. Students hurried between libraries and lecture halls, scarves wound tight, their conversations carrying fragments of structural mechanics and urban theory. Clara pushed her cleaning cart through the cold corridors, her thin gloves no match for the draft that seeped through old windows. She noticed how snow drifted on the ledge of Gund Hall, softening the sharp lines of its concrete facade. Bridges, she thought, also needed softening. Steel tempered by suspension, compression met by tensile grace. Everything in engineering, as in life, was balance. That evening, as she emptied wastebaskets and scrubbed chalkboards, she lingered before a board filled with scrawls from an advanced seminar. Among the chalk dust lay a question that had always haunted engineers. How do we tame turbulence? On the board were the Navier-Stokes equations, dense as scripture. Clara read them silently, her lips barely moving. She knew each term: the density, the inertial acceleration, the pressure gradient, the viscous diffusion, the external force. They were old companions. Professors once told her that Navier-Stokes was the unfinished epic of physics, a system still unresolved in its deepest forms. Predicting turbulence was like predicting grief. You knew it would come, but never exactly how it would twist. Clara brushed her palm across the dusty board, smearing chalk until the letters dissolved. She felt as though she were erasing herself as well, vanishing her name from every contribution as she had done for years. Later, in her closet, she pulled scraps together again. This time she tried to model not a bridge, but the wake of wind across it. She cut strips of paper into narrow ribbons, suspended them above her cardboard span with pins. With her breath she blew softly, watching the fluttering. At times the strips oscillated with gentle rhythm. Other times they erupted into wild, chaotic swirls. Turbulence, she whispered. The song that never repeats. Her daughter's photograph, taped to the wall, watched over her. 12 years old now, living with Clara's sister in Baton Rouge, the girl knew only fragments of her mother's mind. Clara never burdened her with talk of equations, but in secret letters, she would sometimes sketch little arches and beams, calling them bridges to the future. On the second week of December, Clara encountered the same student she had helped. His name was David Lynn. He approached her timidly in the corridor. "Miss James," he said, his voice carrying an unusual respect for a janitor. Would you look at something?" She hesitated, glancing at her cart, her mop. But his eyes pleaded. They sat in a silent corner of the cafeteria after midnight. David spread blueprints across the table, his hands trembling. "My new assignment," he said. "A pedestrian bridge across the Charles River. But the wind loads, I cannot model them right. The simulation says instability." Clara traced the lines with a finger, following the span. "Your supports are sound. The problem is the airflow across the deck. You must ask not only how much force, but how the vortices shed." He blinked. "The Von Karman Vortex Street." "Yes," she said softly. "It is like rows of ghosts behind the bridge, each pulling at the span in rhythm. If that rhythm matches the bridge's frequency, it dances itself apart." David leaned forward, mesmerized. Clara continued, her voice low but steady. You need to adjust the stiffness. Perhaps increase the depth of the deck, or introduce fairings to change the flow separation. This is why many modern bridges use streamlined cross-sections. He scribbled furiously, nodding. But how do you know all this? You never... He stopped himself. He had almost said you never studied here. Clara only smiled faintly. Some lessons stay even when life interrupts. When David left, clutching his notes, Clara remained at the table. A custodian's badge still hung on her chest, yet in that moment she felt more like a ghost professor, teaching from the margins, leaving no trace but the echo of understanding in someone else's mind. A week later, David's model presentation drew astonishment. He had reshaped his deck, explained vortex shedding, and even cited early work on turbulence modeling. His professors nodded gravely. A senior lecturer muttered, "This boy is finally seeing the wind." Clara, unseen behind the cleaning cart, heard it all. She continued polishing brass handles as though her heart were not burning with equal parts pride and grief. Christmas approached. Snow deepened. In the janitor's closet, Clara built her own silent experiment. She attempted a crude simulation of turbulence, not with computers, but with bowls of water and drops of ink. The swirls mesmerized her. Ink spread like sorrow, never predictable, never still. Yet even in its chaos, beauty formed. Patterns emerged, dissolved, and returned, like memory itself. One evening, a professor, Professor Henley, stern and gray, noticed her emerging from the closet, hands ink-stained. He frowned. "What are you doing in there, Ms. James?" Clara bowed her head. "Just cleaning, sir." Henley glanced past her, glimpsing cardboard and strings. He said nothing more, only shook his head and walked on. But Clara knew suspicion had entered. The walls of Harvard were high, and those who did not belong were not meant to climb them, even in shadows. That night, alone again, Clara whispered to the photograph of her daughter, "I will not cross these bridges. They are not mine to walk. But maybe one day you will." She closed her eyes, hearing the hum of the radiator like the rush of wind across a span. Equations filled her mind, not as symbols now, but as lullabies. Navier-Stokes murmuring of hidden currents, Bernoulli of pressure and flight, resonance of fragile harmony. She drifted into sleep among the smell of bleach and the silence of stone. And in her dream, a bridge rose from the Charles River, not of steel or concrete, but of paper and ink, suspended between sorrow and hope. It swayed, yet it did not fall. January came with its hard winds and iron skies. Snow piled against the stone steps of Harvard's libraries, and the Charles River froze in patches, its surface broken by slow-moving shards of ice. The campus seemed quieter, as though even the students' voices had been muffled by the weight of the season. Clara moved through the cold corridors with her cart, the wheels squeaking faintly. Every hallway echoed with the steady rhythm of her work, but her mind was elsewhere, circling the equations she had seen scrawled on boards. Modal analysis, eigenfrequencies, words that to most students were burdens, yet to her were hymns she carried in silence. One night, as she mopped the floor outside the architecture studio, she overheard two students arguing. "You do not understand," one said. "If the natural frequency of the bridge aligns with the loading, resonance occurs. It is basic." "And I am telling you," the other replied, "the calculation is not that simple. It is a multimode system. You cannot just treat it as a single oscillator." They passed by, their voices fading, but the argument lingered in Clara's mind. She remembered her own lectures years ago, where an old professor had explained that every structure has its own hidden music. A beam does not only bend once, it bends in patterns, each with its own tone. These tones, these eigenfrequencies, could mean the difference between harmony and disaster. Later that night, she gathered her scraps again. On the floor of the janitor's closet, she set up a cardboard beam balanced on two supports. With a small stick, she tapped it gently. The vibration made the fishing lines tremble. She watched closely, noting how the oscillation changed when she added weight or shifted the supports. The first mode was simple, the beam sagging in one arc. The second mode appeared when she tapped differently, the beam bending with two arcs, like a wave caught halfway. Each frequency carried its own story. She whispered to herself, her voice steady. The natural frequency depends on stiffness and mass. Higher stiffness, higher frequency. Greater mass, lower frequency. And every change in the span changes the song. For her, this was not only theory, it was memory. She remembered standing on an unfinished overpass in Louisiana, watching as trucks thundered across temporary supports. The whole structure shook beneath her feet, alive with hidden voices. Her husband had laughed at her worry, coughing into his hand. "It holds, Clara. Steel always holds." But she had known, even then, that steel sings before it breaks. In the quiet of Harvard, surrounded by mops and bleach bottles, Clara listened again to that song. A week later, David returned. His face was pale from long nights, but his eyes carried a new spark. "Miss James," he said, lowering his voice, "they gave us a project in dynamic analysis. We need to predict the resonance of a pedestrian bridge under rhythmic loads. I tried, but my model just collapses in simulation." Clara studied his sketches. She saw the simplified equation he had written, frequency equal to the square root of stiffness over mass. "This is true for one mode," she told him gently, "but a bridge has many. Think of it as a choir, not a single voice. If a crowd walks across in step, they may excite not the first mode, but a higher one." David frowned, uncertain. Clara reached for a piece of cardboard. She cut a thin strip, laid it across two chairs, and tapped it. The strip bent in one curve. She tapped again, differently, and now two curves appeared. "Each shape," she explained, "is a mode. Each mode has its own frequency. Engineers use matrices to capture this, to calculate all possible songs a bridge can sing. It is called modal analysis." He leaned forward, absorbing every word. "But that is beyond our class. They do not teach us the full method yet." Clara gave a small smile. "Sometimes life does not wait for lessons. You must listen deeper." For hours they worked in silence. She guided him through the idea of mass matrices, stiffness matrices, and how solving the eigenvalue problem revealed the natural frequencies. She did not overwhelm him with symbols, but showed through cardboard, strings, and rhythm. He tapped, she listened, and slowly understanding bloomed. When he finally left, David whispered, "If only you were the professor." Clara shook her head. "No, I am only someone who cleans the floor." Yet that night, when she was alone, she allowed herself one tear. Not for envy, but for the ache of unrealized life. At the end of January, David presented his analysis. He explained how rhythmic walking could cause resonance, citing the famous case of the Millennium Bridge in London, which swayed under the synchronized steps of pedestrians until engineers added dampers. His model was not perfect, but his grasp of modes and frequencies surprised even the professors. Clara heard the applause from the hallway. She wiped down the brass door handle, her rag moving in circles, as pride and sorrow mingled within her chest. Later, as she rested in the closet, she looked at the cardboard beam she had built. It still held faint scars from her taps. She thought of her daughter again, imagining one day teaching her not only how to cross a bridge, but how to hear its hidden voice. The Harvard walls remained high, guarded, suspicious of those who did not belong. Professor Henley's cold glance still haunted her. Yet inside the small closet, Clara carried knowledge like a flame cupped against the wind. She closed her eyes and whispered to the silent room. Every bridge has a frequency. Every life does too. Mine may not be heard in lecture halls, but perhaps it will resonate in the hearts of those who listened. And in the stillness, she could almost hear it, the faint hum of cardboard, the music of steel imagined, the frequency of silence that was her own. February brought rain that froze into gray sheets along the sidewalks of Cambridge. The air smelled of iron and damp stone, and the Charles River, swollen and restless, seemed to carry its own sorrow beneath the cracked ice. Inside Gund Hall, Clara moved through dim corridors with her cart, her mop leaving long streaks across the marble floor. The students had returned from winter break, their eyes weary but their voices restless, filled with talk of projects, deadlines, and designs they were sure would change the world. Clara listened, as always, catching fragments of terms she had once written in her own notebooks. Topology optimization, computational efficiency, generative design. The words sounded almost alien in her ears, yet when she closed her eyes, the logic returned like an old melody. Optimization was nothing more than the art of balance, the search for form that held the most with the least. She had done this with cardboard, with scraps, with her very life, carrying her daughter's needs on the smallest wages, stretching grief into quiet endurance. Clara had been optimizing long before machines tried. One night, as she wiped chalk dust from a lecture board, she saw diagrams scattered in the corner of the room. She paused. The drawings were outlines of bridge trusses, lines branching like bare trees. Beside them were notes about algorithms, genetic methods, gradient descent, reinforcement learning. The professor had scribbled in the margin, "How to teach a computer to design as an engineer does." Clara knelt, tracing the lines with her eyes. She remembered a lecture she had once heard about optimization problems, how engineers would search through countless possible designs, discarding thousands until one remained, elegant and efficient. Computers now did this work, iterating faster than human patience allowed. Yet Clara, with only pencil and instinct, had always done the same in silence. She would fold cardboard beams again and again, discarding those that buckled too soon, keeping only the ones that bore weight with grace. Later, in her closet, she experimented again. She cut strips of paper, arranging them into small lattice trusses. She asked herself, what if the bridge must carry more weight but with less material? She removed one strip, shifted another, tied them with string, then blew air across the model to test its steadiness. She felt almost as though the paper whispered back, telling her where strength wanted to live. When David appeared at her door that week, his face pale from sleepless nights, she was not surprised. "They gave us a project," he said, his voice cracking. "We are to design a lightweight pedestrian bridge with minimal material. They want us to use optimization software, but I cannot make sense of the parameters. The program keeps spitting out impossible shapes, forms that twist or collapse." Clara motioned him inside. She sat with him on the cold floor, blueprints spread between them. "The computer is only doing what you tell it. It does not know beauty. It does not know safety. It only knows to minimize or maximize. You must guide it, as a mother guides a child. Too much freedom, and it runs into danger. Too much restriction, and it cannot breathe." David frowned. "But how do I choose the right constraints?" Clara picked up a strip of cardboard and bent it. "Think of stiffness. Think of load paths. Every piece of material wants to carry force in the straightest line. If the algorithm gives you curves, Ask if those curves serve the force or if they are only noise. That is how you guide it. He scribbled notes furiously, his eyes wide. It is like teaching the program to think as you do. Clara shook her head gently. No, you must not ask it to think like me. You must ask it to think like the bridge itself. For hours they worked. David adjusted his parameters, adding constraints, rerunning his optimization. Clara explained softly, comparing the computer's output to her cardboard trials. She spoke of load distribution, of how each bar in a truss should sing with the others. By dawn, David's screen displayed a design both efficient and graceful, a lattice of steel lines curved like wings, yet grounded in strength. When he looked at her, his eyes shone with gratitude. Without you, I would never have found this. Clara lowered her gaze. It is your project. Do not forget that. Later that week, David presented his design. The professors were startled. They had expected crude forms from undergraduate hands, not the elegance of a bridge that seemed both organic and precise. One professor muttered that it looked like something an advanced algorithm might have suggested, but refined by a human touch. The class applauded, and David flushed with pride. Clara heard it from the hallway, pushing her mop slowly past the glass door. She did not look in, but the sound reached her heart like a tide. She thought of her husband, coughing blood as he left the construction site for the last time. She thought of her daughter, far away, holding letters sketched with arches. Perhaps, she thought, one day her child would cross a bridge built by someone she had helped. But not all eyes were kind. Professor Henley watched David with suspicion. He noticed details too advanced for a student at that stage. His sharp gaze turned often toward the door, as though he sensed the presence of another mind hidden in the margins. Clara felt his stare even when he was not near. That evening, as she wiped down the brass handles, Henley passed her in the hall. He stopped. "Ms. James," he said coldly, "you spend much time near the students." Clara froze, her rag tightening in her hand. "I only clean, sir." Henley studied her for a long moment, then nodded curtly and walked away. But Clara knew the danger. Knowledge, when it came from the wrong mouth, could be seen not as a gift, but as trespass. In her closet that night, she sat before her cardboard truss. The rain outside tapped against the window, sounding like the footsteps of those who belonged, passing her by. She placed her palm on the fragile bridge, her hand trembling. "Do not be afraid," she whispered to the paper. "You are not mine to keep. You are theirs to build." She leaned back, closing her eyes. The equations of optimization circled in her mind: search spaces, constraints, local minima, global solutions. She thought of her own life, the choices she had made, the sacrifices. She wondered if she had found only a local minimum, a shallow valley where survival lay, but not joy. Yet even in that valley she had carried strength. Perhaps her true optimization was not for herself, but for those she quietly lifted. As sleep pulled her under, Clara dreamed of bridges grown like trees, their lines shaped not by human pride but by the whisper of wind and water. She dreamed of her daughter walking across one, unafraid, her steps steady, her face lifted toward a horizon Clara herself would never reach. And in that dream, for the first time in many years, Clara felt not erased, but whole. March arrived with reluctant sunlight, the snow shrinking into gray puddles that reflected the brick walls of Harvard Yard. Students shook off their coats, hurrying to classes with the restless energy of spring. Clara continued her quiet path, her cart squeaking along marble floors, her mop whispering across wood. Outwardly, nothing had changed, yet inside her a tide was shifting. Every night she worked with cardboard and string, teaching herself lessons that most students only approached through software. Her closet had become a silent laboratory, its shelves crowded with miniature trusses and models, paper beams pinned with tape, notes scribbled in pencil on the backs of discarded lecture handouts. She carried in her mind not only the grief of her past, but also a treasury of knowledge that no one expected from a woman with a janitor's badge. But others had begun to notice. Professor Henley, in particular. His eyes, sharp and cold, often lingered on Clara whenever he passed her in the hall. She felt his gaze not only on her body, but on the space around her, as if he were searching for the hidden bridges she kept tucked away. One afternoon, Clara was scrubbing chalk dust from a board when Henley entered. He carried a folder under his arm, his steps quick, impatient. He stopped when he saw her, his lips tightening. "You seem to take an unusual interest in these rooms, Ms. James," he said. Clara kept her eyes on the cloth in her hand. "I only clean, sir." Henley set the folder on the desk and studied her. "Students have presented work recently that far exceeds their usual capacity. Ideas they could not have produced alone. You would not happen to know anything about that, would you?" Her hand froze for just a moment, but she forced it to keep moving, wiping in slow circles. "I am only here after hours," she said softly. Henley leaned closer, his shadow stretching across the board. "Knowledge belongs to those who earn it, Ms. James. It is not for trespassers. Remember that." He left the room with a snap of the door. Clara's chest tightened, her rag damp in her fist. She had known this moment would come, the moment when her silent gifts would be seen not as kindness, but as intrusion. That night she sat in her closet staring at the models on her shelf. The cardboard bridges seemed fragile, trembling under the dim bulb. She touched one gently, whispering to herself, "I only want them to learn. I only want them to walk across safely." Yet even as she spoke, doubt gnawed at her. Was she risking the little she had, her job, her meager wages, her fragile place in this world, for the sake of a few students who might soon forget her name? The following week, David returned. His face was lit with excitement. "Miss James," he whispered urgently, "the professor assigned us a project in vibration control. They want us to design dampers for a long-span footbridge. I tried, but I cannot stabilize the simulation. The resonance just keeps building." Clara hesitated. Henley's warning still echoed in her mind. She imagined him waiting in the shadows, ready to accuse. But then she looked into David's eyes, so full of need, so raw with desperation. She saw herself at 18, standing in a classroom with a baby already growing inside her, knowing her time was ending. She could not turn away. She motioned him inside the closet. Together they spread his drawings across the floor. Clara studied them quietly, then spoke. "Every structure has its song," she said. "When that song grows too loud, we must add another voice to quiet it. That is the damper's role." She showed him with cardboard and string, attaching a small weight to the side of the span. She let it swing as the bridge vibrated, its motion countering the oscillation. "This is called a tuned mass damper," she explained. "It moves opposite to the bridge's vibration, stealing energy from the resonance. Engineers use it in skyscrapers and long spans. Without it, even a strong structure can fall to rhythm." David's eyes widened. He had seen the term in textbooks, but never grasped it until now. He bent close, adjusting the string, testing the balance. The model settled quickly after each tap. His breath caught. "It works," he whispered. "It actually works." Clara smiled faintly. "It is not magic. It is patience. Everything in this world seeks balance." When he left, he promised again to keep her name secret. But Clara knew secrets had a way of slipping loose. A few days later, she overheard Henley questioning students. His voice carried down the hall, sharp and skeptical. "Where did you learn this? Who told you about tuned mass dampers? It is not in your syllabus." Silence followed, nervous shuffling. Clara held her breath behind the cleaning cart, her rag pressed tight in her hand. She knew David would not betray her, but Henley was not a man easily deceived. That night she could not bring herself to build. She sat in her closet, staring at her daughter's photograph. She spoke aloud, her voice trembling. "I am trying to give them what I never had. But maybe I am only stealing from a world that does not want me." The radiator hummed, the pipes knocking softly like distant drums. Clara closed her eyes, listening to the rhythm. She imagined it as another vibration waiting for balance, another bridge searching for its damper. Days passed, heavy with unease. She worked quietly, head lowered, speaking little. Yet she could not stop listening, could not stop caring. Every time she heard a student stumble over equations, every time she saw fear in their eyes, her heart ached with the weight of what she knew. Late in March, a storm swept through Cambridge, rain pounding the windows. Clara walked the empty hallways, mop in hand, her reflection wavering in the wet tiles. She paused outside a studio where students had left their models half-finished, paper and balsa wood scattered like wreckage. She stepped inside, touching the fragile pieces, her fingers brushing across beams too thin, joints too weak. She could see failure before it even happened. She gathered a few scraps, fitting them together, showing with quiet hands how the load might travel differently, how the form could bend but not break. For a moment she forgot the danger, forgot Henley's warning. She was only herself again, the girl from Louisiana who once believed she could build anything. The door opened behind her. A shadow stretched across the floor. "Ms. James," Henley said, his voice low, "what exactly are you doing?" Clara froze, the cardboard still in her hands. She turned slowly, her eyes steady though her heart pounded. "I am cleaning, sir," she said softly. Henley stepped closer, his gaze piercing. "Cleaning. With models in your hands. Do not play games with me. I know what you are." Clara lowered her eyes, her fingers tightening on the cardboard. She said nothing. Henley studied her for a long, silent moment, then turned sharply and left. The door slammed behind him, echoing through the empty hall. Clara stood motionless, her body trembling. She knew the storm was no longer only outside. It had entered these walls, and it was coming for her. That night, she placed her hand on the cardboard bridge in her closet and whispered, "If they take this from me, let me still hold the memory. Let me keep the song." And for the first time since her husband's death, Clara prayed, not for herself, but for the chance to keep giving, even if the world refused to see. April arrived with restless winds. The Charles River carried broken branches and rain-swollen currents, its surface rippling under the sharp gusts. Students filled the courtyards with nervous laughter, their spring projects piling high, deadlines rushing toward them like floodwaters. For Clara, each day carried the same rhythm: mop, wipe, empty, sweep. Yet beneath the surface, her life no longer held the same stillness. The storm Henley carried in his eyes had grown heavier, and she knew it would break soon. One morning she entered the architecture studio early, the halls still quiet. On the board from the night before was a drawing of a suspension bridge, lines marked with equations of resonance and damping. She traced them with her finger, murmuring softly. The natural frequency depends on stiffness and mass. The damping ratio defines the decay. The system lives or dies by its ability to absorb rhythm. She wiped the board clean before the students arrived, but the words lingered in her mind. As she moved through the day, she thought of her own life as a system under load, her strength eroded by each vibration of sorrow, each cycle of hidden labor. She wondered how long until her own resonance grew unbearable. That evening, David came to her again. His face was drawn, his eyes ringed with fatigue. "They assigned us a full-scale project," he said, almost whispering. "We must design a footbridge to span the river model in the laboratory. It must survive simulated wind and pedestrian loads. I cannot do it alone. Will you?" His voice faltered. Clara hesitated. Henley's warning still echoed, yet David looked at her the way her daughter once had, eyes pleading, asking for guidance through a world too heavy. She nodded. "Come," she said. In the closet, they worked through the night. Clara guided him gently, never taking the pencil fully into her own hand, but shaping his thoughts. She explained how topology optimization could reduce unnecessary material, how tuned dampers could be placed near supports, how modal analysis could predict hidden weaknesses. She compared the bridge to a living body, each part needing balance to keep the whole alive. By dawn, David's design had clarity, a structure that seemed both light and strong, shaped not by chance, but by wisdom passed in whispers. He thanked her with a trembling voice, but Clara only shook her head. "Do not speak of me. This is your work. Carry it with humility." A week later, Clara's quiet world cracked. She was sweeping the hallway outside the laboratory when she heard raised voices. Henley's tone was sharp, the sound of steel against stone. "This design, too sophisticated for an undergraduate. Who is helping you?" David's reply was muffled, uncertain. Clara froze, her broom trembling in her hand. Henley pressed again. "Do not lie to me. These concepts are advanced. Someone is feeding you knowledge beyond your station." Clara turned quickly, pushing her cart down the hall before she could hear more. Her heart pounded like a hammer striking steel. She knew the truth was drawing too near. That night, as she polished the brass handles, Henley appeared suddenly at her side. "Ms. James," he said coldly, "come with me." He led her into the empty classroom. The air smelled of chalk and old wood. He shut the door behind them, his face stern. "I have watched you," he began. "You linger in these halls long after your duties are done. Students present ideas that are not theirs. And every time I see you nearby, tell me the truth. What are you doing?" Clara stood silent, her hands folded, her eyes lowered. Henley stepped closer. "You think knowledge is free. It is not. It belongs to those who earn it, who dedicate their lives, who belong here. You do not. You never will. If you interfere with my students again, I will have you removed." The words struck her like blows, yet she did not flinch. She lifted her eyes slowly, meeting his gaze with quiet strength. "I never claimed their work as mine. I never asked for anything. I only wanted them to see what they already carry inside. Is that theft?" Henley's jaw tightened. "It is trespass. This institution is not for you." Clara's throat tightened. She thought of her husband, of his lungs filled with dust, of how he too had been told the world was not for him. She thought of her daughter, her small hands clutching letters marked with arches. She thought of all the bridges she had built in silence, only to lock them away. She drew a breath. Perhaps not. But knowledge belongs to no building. It belongs to anyone who listens deeply enough, even those with mops in their hands. For a moment, Henley faltered, his eyes narrowing, but then he shook his head sharply. "One more step out of place, Ms. James, and you are gone." He left, the door slamming behind him. Clara stood alone in the echoing room, her hands trembling. She walked slowly back to her closet, her chest tight, her breath unsteady. She looked at her cardboard bridges, lined neatly on the shelves. For the first time, they seemed fragile not only in body but in purpose, as though they might collapse under the weight of her fear. She sat on the floor, her back against the wall. Tears welled in her eyes, but she forced them back. She whispered to the photograph of her daughter, "If they silence me, I will still write to you. I will still send you the drawings. No one can take that." Days passed in heavy silence. Clara kept to her work, her head lowered, her footsteps soft. David tried to approach her once, but she shook her head, her eyes warning him away. She could not risk another shadow falling across her life. Yet even as she withdrew, the fire within her did not die. At night, when the halls were silent, she still built. She still tested beams, still whispered equations to herself. Knowledge was not something that could be taken. It lived inside her, deep and steady, like the heartbeat of steel. On the last night of April, she dreamed again of bridges. This time they stretched across not only rivers but years, each one carrying her sorrow into the distance. In the dream, she walked halfway across, then stopped, turning back. She could not reach the far shore, but behind her she saw others crossing. Students, her daughter, faces she barely knew. And she understood. Her bridges were never meant for her own feet. They were meant for those who came after. When she woke, the closet was cold, the models trembling in the draft. She laid her hand on one gently, whispering, "Hold, even if I cannot." And with that, she rose and returned to her mop, her cart, her silent path through Harvard's endless halls. May opened with lilacs blooming along Harvard Yard, their scent sweet yet heavy, as though nature herself carried secrets in the air. Students hurried across the grass, their notebooks clutched tight, voices alive with both excitement and dread. Final projects loomed, and the pressure of proving themselves weighed down every step. For Clara, the month carried a different kind of weight, one that pressed against her chest with each passing day. Professor Henley's warning echoed still. His eyes had grown sharper each time they crossed paths. Clara could feel him watching even when he was not present, as if his suspicions seeped into the very walls. She had always lived on the margins, unseen, uncounted, but now her invisibility had cracked. One afternoon, as she scrubbed the lecture hall floor, 2 administrators entered with Henley. They carried clipboards, their expressions cold and efficient. Clara kept her head down, her mop moving in slow arcs, but their voices carried across the room. "There are irregularities in recent student work," one administrator said. "Concepts presented that are beyond their coursework. We need to ensure academic integrity." Henley's reply was sharp. "I have reason to believe someone is interfering. Someone who does not belong here." Clara's hand froze on the mop handle. She lowered her head further, praying they would not turn toward her. But she felt Henley's gaze, steady and merciless, pressing into her back. When they left, her knees nearly gave way. She leaned against the mop, her breath unsteady. The storm was no longer distant. It had arrived. That night, she sat in her closet staring at the cardboard models. They seemed fragile, trembling under the weak bulb. She thought of destroying them, of tearing every bridge to pieces so there would be no trace of her trespass. But as her hand hovered over one span, she could not bring herself to break it. These bridges had carried her through grief, through silence, through nights when she thought her soul might collapse. To destroy them would be to erase herself entirely. Instead, she whispered, "Hold a little longer. Just a little longer." The next evening, David appeared, pale and anxious. "They are questioning us," he said quickly. "Professor Henley is asking how we know these concepts. He suspects. He is closing in." Clara shook her head. You must deny it. Protect yourself. But what about you? David whispered. You are the one who gave me everything. Clara looked into his desperate eyes and felt both pride and sorrow. Then you must give it forward, she said softly. Do not waste what you have learned. Even if I am gone, the knowledge will live through you. He wanted to argue, but her gaze silenced him. He left reluctantly, his steps heavy with guilt. 2 days later, Clara was summoned. A note left on her cart instructed her to report to the administration office. Her hands trembled as she read the words. She had never been called there before. She knew what it meant. The office smelled of varnished wood and stale coffee. A panel of administrators sat behind a long table. Henley stood to one side, his arms crossed. Ms. James, the dean began, questions have been raised regarding your conduct. It has been suggested that you are engaging in activities outside your role as custodian, specifically that you may have influenced student projects. Do you deny this? Clara's throat tightened. She could feel Henley's eyes drilling into her. She wanted to speak, to tell the truth, to explain that she had only given what she could never claim for herself. But she also knew that in this room, truth was not protection. It was surrender. I clean the halls, she said quietly. That is all. Henley stepped forward. She lingers after hours. She is seen with students. Their work has advanced unnaturally. I am certain she is the source. The dean sighed. Ms. James, we cannot permit interference with academic work. You are here under employment, not enrollment. If there is evidence of impropriety, we will have no choice but to terminate your position. Clara bowed her head. Her hands trembled in her lap, yet her voice, when it came, was steady. I have never taken credit for their work. I have never asked for recognition. If they have grown, it is because they listened. Knowledge is not a crime. The room fell silent. The administrators exchanged glances. Henley's jaw tightened. Finally, the dean said, We will review further. For now, return to your duties. But understand, this matter is not closed. Clara rose, her legs heavy, and walked out with her head low. The corridors blurred before her eyes. She reached her closet and closed the door behind her, sinking to the floor. For a long time, she did not move. That night, she wrote a letter to her daughter. She did not mention Henley or the threat of losing her job. She only drew another bridge, delicate arches spanning a river of ink. Beneath it, she wrote, Someday you will walk across something I could not, and you will not be afraid. She folded the letter carefully, pressing her palm against it as though to seal her love inside. In the days that followed, Clara worked more quietly than ever. She avoided the students, avoided even looking at their projects. She moved like a shadow through the halls, her mop strokes slow, her gaze lowered. Yet inside her, the fire burned still. Every time she wiped chalk from a board, equations whispered back to her. Every time she picked up scraps from the floor, models formed in her mind. Henley watched, waiting for her to falter. She felt his presence in every room, his suspicion in every silence. She knew the exile he promised was near. But she also knew something else. Even if they cast her out, even if she left these halls forever, the bridges she had built would remain. They would stand not in her name, but in the lives she had touched. One evening, as she sat alone in the closet, she placed her hand on the largest model she had made, a cardboard span with strings stretched like harp strings across its frame. She closed her eyes and whispered, If they take everything from me, let this still stand. Let this still sing. The wind outside howled through the old windows, rattling them like a chorus of unseen voices. Clara listened, and for a moment, she felt not fear, but resolve. The storm was coming, but she would meet it with silence, with dignity, and with the quiet strength of one who had already lost everything once before. By June, Harvard Yard was a sea of green. Leaves rustled in the soft wind, and students poured through the campus in a frenzy of final presentations. Models of towers, bridges, and cities filled the studios, some precise, some fragile, many unfinished. The air buzzed with nerves and exhaustion. Clara continued her rounds, her mop tracing the marble in long strokes, but the weight inside her grew heavier each day. She knew the review board would not wait long. Henley pressed harder. His shadow stretched across every corridor she entered. One evening, she found David waiting by the door to her closet. His face was pale, his hands clenched. "They are going to remove you," he whispered. "Henley says he has proof. He wants you gone by the end of the month." Clara's chest tightened. She had expected this, yet hearing it aloud hollowed her. "Then it is done," she said softly. "No," David shook his head. "We will not let it be. Others know. Others have seen. You are not alone." Clara touched his arm gently. "Do not risk yourself. The bridge must be yours, not mine. If I fall, you must still cross." But David's eyes carried a fire she had not seen before. "You gave me my voice. I will not let them silence yours." The following week, the board convened. Word spread quietly among the students. They whispered in corners, passing rumors like folded notes. Some said the janitor would be dismissed. Others said there would be a hearing. A few said she was more than a janitor, though none dared speak too loudly. The hearing took place in a long, oak-paneled room. Clara sat at one end of the table, her custodian's badge pinned to her chest, her hands folded tightly. Across from her sat the dean and two administrators. To the side, Henley loomed, his eyes cold, his mouth set in a thin line. "Ms. James," the dean began, "concerns have been raised about your conduct. Professor Henley has reported that you may have been assisting students with academic work beyond your role. Do you deny this?" Clara lifted her eyes slowly. Her voice, though quiet, carried steady. "I have never taken their projects for myself. I have never asked for credit. I only cleaned these halls. But when a student asked for understanding, I shared what little I knew. Knowledge is not a possession. It is a light. Sometimes all I did was hold the lamp." Henley's jaw tightened. She trivializes her trespass. These are not lamps, but blueprints. Advanced methods, concepts beyond their level. They did not come from themselves. They came from her. This is academic dishonesty, and she must be removed. The dean exchanged glances with the others. The silence stretched. Then a voice broke it. "Sir," David said. He had entered quietly, standing at the back of the room with a group of students. His hands trembled, but his voice did not. "What she gave us was not answers. It was understanding. She showed us how to listen to the structures themselves, how to see the lines of force. Without her, many of us would have failed. With her, we learned." Henley turned sharply. "This is precisely the problem. She is not faculty. She has no right to teach." Another student stepped forward, a young woman with ink-stained fingers. "With respect, Professor, she never claimed to teach. She never asked for recognition. She only helped us when despair was heavier than equations. If that is wrong, then so is every office hour where a teacher explains more than the textbook." A murmur filled the room. More students appeared in the doorway, their faces anxious, determined. One held up a cardboard model, Clara's method, passed through many hands. "This," he said, "came from her. Not the design, but the courage to keep trying." She reminded us that bridges are not only steel and equations, they are patience and care. Clara's eyes blurred with tears she could not hold back. She had never asked for defenders, never imagined her quiet work would echo beyond the closet. Henley's face darkened. "You do not understand. This is not charity. It is interference. If we allow it, the standards of this institution collapse." The dean raised a hand. The room quieted. His gaze turned to Clara. "Ms. James, what is your intention? Why did you do this, knowing it was not your place?" Clara drew a breath. Her voice shook at first, but steadied with each word. "Because I once stood where they stand. I had a scholarship once. I held the equations in my hands, but I lost it all. Life took me away from these halls. I thought the door was closed forever. But when I walked these corridors again, even with a mop in my hand, I could still hear the voices of steel, the songs of bridges. When I saw their fear, their struggle, I remembered my own. I could not stay silent. That is all I have done. I lit a candle in the dark." The silence afterward was deep. Some administrators looked away, their faces heavy. The dean pressed his hands together, his eyes unreadable. Finally he said, "We will deliberate. For now, you may remain at your post. This matter is not closed, but nor is it decided." The room emptied slowly. Students lingered near Clara, their eyes full of gratitude, but she only bowed her head. When they left, she returned alone to her closet. She sat among her models, tears slipping silently down her face. She touched the cardboard bridges with trembling fingers. For the first time, she realized she was not invisible. For the first time, she understood that even silence could be heard when others chose to listen. But she also knew Henley would not stop. The storm had not ended. It had only paused. She whispered to herself, "Hold steady, little bridges. Hold until the end." That night she dreamed again. A bridge stretched across the Charles River, vast and luminous, built not of steel, but of voices. Each student's voice formed a beam, each memory a cable. And though Henley stood on the banks shouting, the bridge held, because it was carried by many, not one. Clara woke with the dawn, her heart trembling. The fight was not over, but she was no longer alone. July heat pressed down on Cambridge, and Gund Hall felt more like a furnace than a studio. In the laboratory, a scaled pedestrian bridge stood waiting on its supports. Aluminum members gleamed under fluorescent lights, cables drawn taut, sensors taped along the span. It was the students' final test, to subject their bridge to wind and rhythmic loads. Clara moved silently with her cart in the corridor outside. She told herself to keep walking, to stay invisible. Yet the sound of the lab fans rising pulled her closer, as if the bridge itself called her name. She leaned in the doorway, eyes lowered, pretending to rest. Inside, Professor Henley oversaw the trial. "Increase amplitude," he instructed. The electric shakers under the deck began to hum. The span quivered. On the monitor, spectral peaks rose. Clara's ear caught something the graphs did not. A thin chatter from the west truss, the sound of a loose joint. She knew the risk, resonance coupling between modes. Push harder, and the span could twist itself into ruin. "Stop now," she said before she could silence herself. Heads turned. Henley's eyes narrowed. "Ms. James, you are not authorized here." David, crouched at midspan, lifted his head. "Professor, she is right. There's movement at the west truss. I can feel it." The bridge gave another groan. A brace rang high and hollow. Clara stepped forward, tapping it lightly with a tool. "Loose," she said. "Reseat the bolt, and the second mode will quiet." For a breathless moment, Henley seemed ready to deny her. Then curtly, "Do it." Students obeyed. When the shakers resumed, the deck vibrated but no longer threatened. The second peak on the monitor faded. Relief swept the room, yet Henley's face did not soften. "You will leave this lab at once," he said. Clara bowed her head and stepped back into the corridor. Her heart pounded, but she knew what would follow. She had crossed a line that could not be hidden. By morning, an email arrived. Effective immediately, Ms. Clara James is dismissed from employment for repeated violation of laboratory policy and interference with academic activity. Security will escort her from premises. She sat in her closet, the words heavy in her hands. Around her, cardboard bridges lined the shelf, silent witnesses to years of hidden labor. She lifted the one she loved most, a small suspension with fishing line cables, and placed it gently in a shoebox. From the wall, she took the photograph of her daughter. When the guards arrived, Clara did not resist. She walked the corridors one last time, students watching from doorways. David whispered her name, but she shook her head softly. No farewell could hold what had already been given. At the gate, she paused beneath the summer trees. The shoebox felt light in her arms, yet heavier than anything she had carried. She heard the whisper of wind in the leaves, like the faint hum of a bridge settling into balance. She stepped onto the bus without looking back. Harvard faded behind her like a shoreline at dusk. Ahead lay roads of dust and long light, the home she had left, and children who had never held a bridge in their hands. She rested her palm on the lid of the shoebox. "Hold," she whispered to the model inside, and "hold until they need you." And the bus carried her south, away from the halls that had refused her, toward a horizon where her bridges might finally find feet to cross them. August's sun lay heavy over Louisiana, a sun that carried not the sharp light of Harvard's stone courtyards, but the long, forgiving warmth of fields and dust roads. Clara stepped down from the bus with her shoebox in her arms. The air smelled of clay and cut grass. Cicadas droned in the trees, their song both weary and eternal. She had returned not to triumph, but to simplicity. The parish where she had grown up was still poor, still quiet, still waiting. Wooden houses leaned slightly under years of storms. Children played barefoot near ditches. The only bridge nearby was a cracked concrete span over a dry creek bed. Yet as Clara walked down the familiar road, she felt a peace she had not known in years. Here no one expected her to be invisible. Here she was simply Clara, daughter, mother, neighbor. Her sister's house stood at the edge of the fields. From the porch, her daughter, now 13, looked up with eyes that held both shyness and longing. Clara opened her arms. The girl hesitated only a moment before running into them. For a long time they held each other. The shoebox pressed between them like a secret. That night, under a bare bulb at the kitchen table, Clara opened the box. Inside lay the small suspension bridge of cardboard and fishing line. Her daughter touched it with awe. "Did you make this at Harvard?" she asked. Clara nodded slowly. "Yes, and many more. But this one came home with me." The girl tilted her head. "Will you build more here?" Clara looked at her, then at the cousins and neighbor children who had gathered around the table, their eyes wide with curiosity. "Yes," she said softly, "but this time, not alone." "We will build them together." Word spread quickly through the parish. At first, it was just a few children gathering in the evenings to fold cardboard and tape string. Clara showed them how to cut clean lines, how to balance loads, how to listen for the sound of a joint too loose. She spoke in simple words, but always with precision. "A beam bends because it carries more than itself," she told them. "But if you give it friends, trusses, braces, it will hold. Like us." The children laughed, but they listened. They began to see shapes not just as toys, but as ideas. When one model collapsed, Clara did not scold. She set it upright again and whispered, "Failure is only the bridge teaching you where it wants to stand." As weeks passed, the table grew crowded with models. Some were crude, others astonishing in their balance. Parents began to peek through the door, curious at the quiet energy that filled the room. Clara explained to them that she was not teaching mathematics so much as trust. The trust that even in a forgotten parish, a child's hands could hold the language of steel and sky. Letters began to arrive from Harvard. Not official ones. Those doors were closed forever. But from students. David wrote first, his words filled with gratitude. He told her that his bridge had been praised in final review, that he was continuing his studies with a deeper understanding than any syllabus had offered. "I think of you every time I test a model," he wrote. "Your voice is still in the room, even when you are not." Other students followed. Some enclosed sketches, others sent photographs of projects. None mentioned her name aloud at the university, but in their hearts, they carried her. Clara placed each letter carefully in a folder, not to hold pride, but to hold memory. In September, the parish school invited her to speak. She stood in front of a chalkboard for the first time in 15 years. The children looked at her with bright eyes. She felt the old ache in her chest, but this time it was not grief. It was fulfillment. She drew a simple arch, then a truss, then a suspension span. "Every bridge has its own song," she told them. "Some sing low, some high. If you learn to listen, you can make them safe. And maybe one day you will build one that carries not only people, but hope." Her daughter watched from the front row, her face lifted with pride. For Clara, that was enough. Seasons turned. The models grew more ambitious. With donated wood and nails, the children built a small footbridge across the dry creek bed. It was not perfect, but it held. When they crossed it for the first time, hand in hand, Clara felt her husband's presence, as if he walked beside them. He had given his lungs to steel and dust, but here his spirit breathed in laughter and footsteps. At night, when the house was quiet, Clara sat with her notebook. She wrote not to Harvard, not to any dean or professor, but to herself. She recorded lessons about resonance, about turbulence, about optimization. She explained them in simple language, as though speaking to her daughter. She knew she might never publish, never hold a title, but the knowledge would remain, waiting for whoever might need it. One evening, her daughter asked, "Mama, why do you build bridges you never cross?" Clara smiled, brushing her hand over the girl's hair. "Because some bridges are not for us. They are for those who come after. My feet may never step across them, but yours will. And that is enough." The cicadas sang outside. The cardboard bridge glowed under the lamp. Clara felt the quiet settle over her like a warm blanket. She had been erased in one world, but she had written herself into another. Her legacy was not in the halls of Harvard, but in the hands of children folding cardboard into arcs, believing that something fragile could still hold. And so the janitor who once whispered equations to herself in a closet found her true classroom under the slow Louisiana sky. She had no title, no degree, no salary beyond survival. Yet she had something greater, the certainty that knowledge given freely becomes seed, and that seed, even in poor soil, will one day rise. Clara closed her notebook and blew out the lamp. "Hold," she whispered, the same word she had given to her bridges. "Hold until they need you." The night answered with the sound of crickets, steady as a heartbeat, carrying her prayer into the dark. Thank you for walking this journey with Clara. If her story touched you, stay with us. Subscribe, so more bridges of hope can be built together.